The fight over President Trump's push to use the National Guard, it is escalating. On the West Coast, the administration is asking an appeals court to let it send California Guard troops into Portland after a judge blocked that move. In Illinois, a judge has allowed Texas Guard troops to deploy to Chicago, with 200 expected this week. Governor J.B. Pritzker calls it an unconstitutional invasion, and tonight the president is threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, overriding courts and governors.
Necessary, but we have an Insurrection Act for a reason. If I had to enact it, I'd do that. If people were being killed and courts were holding us up, or governors or mayors were holding us up, sure, I'd do that. I mean,
Donald Trump is using our service members as political props and as pawns in his illegal effort to militarize our nation's cities.
With the courts divided and the president signaling he's ready to escalate, the stakes are growing for both sides. Legal analyst Jessica Levinson joins me now to break down what comes next. Thank you so much. Let's just start with the basic here, basic for, I think, everybody, and that is, what is the Insurrection Act, and is President Trump within his right to invoke it?
So the Insurrection Act is a statute that gives the president increased powers. Marla, talked about before when it came to sending the National Guard into Los Angeles, the idea that once the National Guard was federalized in here, they couldn't directly enforce domestic law. Now, there's an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, and that's the Insurrection Act. If you do, as president, invoke the Insurrection Act, then you can have the military acting like a civilian law enforcement agency. You can have members of the National Guard and the Army who are the ones who are actively searching, seizing, performing arrests. And that's something that looks different than most Americans are accustomed to. Now, you ask me, is the president within his rights? I'm going to give a annoying answer, which is we don't have a lot of precedent on this. We just have not seen presidents try to invoke the Insurrection Act. But I think what we're seeing with respect to trying to federalize the National Guard in other areas is that judges are saying the president, any president, is owed deference in this area, but not unfettered deference. So president can't say there's a rebellion when there isn't one. And there'll be a question as to whether or not the president can invoke those increased powers from the Insurrection Act based on the facts on the ground in a variety of different jurisdictions.
Well, you mentioned this idea of a rebellion. The U.S. District Judge that stopped this from happening, we should note, is a Trump appointee, and she ruled that the deployment was unnecessary because the demonstrations did not amount to a rebellion, saying also that law enforcement was capable of handling the protests without military intervention. Jessica, you talk about this being unprecedented. When was the last time the Insurrection Act was invoked?
Oh, my gosh, long time. If I could go back to what you were just talking about with respect to the district court judge in Portland, what she said, and I think this is really important for us, is to think about what she said is, okay, what does the statute require? The statute requires a rebellion or an invasion or the danger of one of those, or that the president is unable to execute federal law through the regular forces. And she's saying, I'm an unelected judge. The presidents get a lot of deference, but you can't make up facts. This was a really strongly worded opinion, which I use to highlight only because if you have a president trying to invoke something even, I would say, more powerful than that, the Insurrection Act, you can imagine that there would be significant judicial scrutiny. Yeah,
well, I mean, my next question then is, President Trump, if he does go ahead with this and, in fact, invoke what he thinks is his right to the Insurrection Act, he would say it's there for a reason, I'm going to invoke this, then who has the power to stop him? What's next?
So then you would have, I think, a suit that look very similar to what happened in California when the president tried to federalize the National Guard, now in Oregon, also in Illinois, where you would have the states bringing cases and saying this violates our state sovereignty. You're trying to take over our police powers. That's not proper under the 10th Amendment. and they would bring these cases before federal judges very quickly, seeking to have temporary restraining orders. And, you know, again, emphasizing this is fairly unprecedented. I will offer that the Insurrection Act, I think, really does envision a situation where you have a president who just cannot enforce federal law without much more backup.
Well, we'll see where this ends up going, which direction. We'll be calling on you, I'm sure, in the future. Jessica Levinson, legal analyst, thank you so much.
Thank